All right, let's jump into this.
Okay.
Today we're looking at something I think a lot of people are curious about, but probably don't think about too much.
Right.
How drugs interact with your body.
Right.
You know, you take a pill or you get an injection. But what happens after that? Honestly, I mean, it's pretty wild when you actually get down to it.
It is. It is.
You sent me some really dense material on pharmacokinetics and dynamics.
Yeah, it.
And I gotta say, it's like reading a secret language.
It's very dense material.
It really is.
Yeah.
Like I said, very few people are probably fluent in this language. So that's our goal today.
Okay.
To decode it.
Okay.
Pull out the really important and interesting stuff without, you know, overwhelming everyone.
Right.
So think of it like this.
Okay.
We're going to try to understand the choreography between a drug and your body.
Okay.
Who's leading, who's following, and what are the key moves?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're going to cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, we are.
We've got how a drug gets into your system, how it actually creates that effect, and how your body gets rid of it. We'll also touch on why some drugs work better through certain routes, like why you take some things orally versus as an injection.
Right.
And what some of these really common terms we hear, like potency and efficacy, really mean.
Yeah. Those are important ones to understand.
Yeah. Get ready for some aha moments as we try to, you know, illuminate this pretty complex but really crucial topic.
It's very important. Yeah.
So to understand this whole dance between drugs and our bodies, we need to start with two key concepts that really kept coming up in the material you sent, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics.
Those are the two big ones.
Yeah, in the simplest terms.
Right.
What's the main difference between these two?
So think of it like this. Pharmacokinetics is what your body does to the drug.
It's the drug's journey through your system, how it gets in, which we call absorption, where it goes, which is distribution, how it's broken down, which is metabolism, and how it leaves, which is elimination.
Got it.
So it's kind of like the processing, the handling of the drug.
Yeah, like the body's security system for checking its passport and all that.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's pharmacokinetics, what the body does to the drug.
Right.
What about pharmacodynamics?
Pharmacodynamics is the opposite of that. It's what the drug does to the body.
Okay.
So this looks at how the drug interacts with your cells, with your tissues, its mechanism of action, and the resulting effects, both the good ones we want and any side effects.
Right. So kinetics is the body acting on the drug.
Yes.
Dynamics is the drug acting on the body.
Exactly. It's a two-way street.
Yeah, two-way street.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's start with pharmacokinetics.
Okay.
What the body does to the drug. And the very first step in that journey is how the drug gets in. And our material went through quite a few routes of administration.
You have a lot of different ways to get drugs into the body.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
The most obvious one is taking a pill.
Right.
Oral administration. Super convenient.
Yeah, very easy.
Right.
Yeah.
But the material suggested that it's surprisingly complex.
It is.
When it comes to how it gets absorbed.
You wouldn't think it.
Right. You just pop a pill.
You think swallow and you're done.
Right.
But it's a whole process.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that make this so complicated?
Well, for one, it has to survive the stomach.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Which is a very harsh environment.
Yeah.
Very acidic.
Right.
And that can actually destroy some drugs.
Yeah.
Before they can even be absorbed.
And then it has to cross through the lining of the GI tract.
Exactly.
To actually get into the bloodstream.
And that's a barrier.
Right.
A barrier.
So if someone overdoses on an oral medication, they often give them activated charcoal in the ER.
Yeah, they do.
And it's kind of like an antidote.
Yeah, it's kind of like a sponge.
Right.
Yeah, it binds to the drug in the stomach and the intestines prevents it from being absorbed.
Right.
So that's one way we can...
That's so interesting. And then we see these terms all the time.
Right.
Enteric coated, extended release.
Yeah.
What's the point of all that?
So enteric coatings protect drugs from that stomach acid.
Oh, okay. So it's like a little shield.
Exactly. It's like a little shield.
Yeah.
It lets the pill pass through the stomach without dissolving. And then it gets into the intestine, which is less acidic.
Okay.
And that's where it can actually be absorbed.
Got it.
Extended release is different.
Okay.
Extended release is designed to release the drug gradually over a longer period of time.
Like a time release capsule.
Exactly like a time release.
Okay.
So you get a more consistent effect, and you don't have to take the pill as often.
Right. So it's like a slow drip instead of...
Exactly. Instead of one big surge.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Now, what about the routes that skip the digestive system altogether?
Okay.
Like sublingual, under the tongue, or buccal between your cheek and gum?
Yeah, so those routes allow for very rapid absorption.
Okay.
Because the tissues under your tongue and in your cheek, they have a lot of blood vessels.
Okay.
So the drug dissolves, goes straight into the bloodstream.
Wow.
Bypasses the stomach, bypasses the intestines.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And it also bypasses something called first-pass metabolism in the liver.
Oh, right.
Which we'll talk about later.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
Okay, so faster and less initial breakdown.
Exactly.
What about injections?
Okay.
We saw 4V intravenous.
Yep.
IM intramuscular.
Right.
And SC subcutaneous.
Yeah, we've got a lot of different ways to inject drugs.
Yeah, we do. So let's start with IV, because that seems like the most direct.
It's the fastest.
Right into the vein.
Straight into the bloodstream.
Right into the bloodstream.
So you get very rapid effect.
Yeah.
And you have the most control over the dose.
Okay.
So this is really useful for drugs that aren't absorbed well orally.
Okay.
Like certain muscle relaxants.
Oh, okay.
That they use during surgery.
Interesting.
Like rocuronium.
Okay.
And it's often given as a single quick dose called a bolus.
Oh, right. A bolus.
Just to get that immediate effect.
Yeah. Okay, what about IM?
So IM is into the muscle.
Into the muscle.
And the speed of absorption depends on the formulation.
Okay.
If it's an aqueous solution, so water-based, it can be absorbed pretty rapidly.
Okay.
But there are also depot preparations, which use oil or non-water-based substances like polyethylene glycol.
Interesting.
And what these do is they cause the drug to form little crystals or droplets at the injection site.
Okay.
And then those dissolve slowly over time. So you get that sustained release.
It's like a time release.
It is. It's built right in.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So subcutaneous, that's just under the skin.
Right under the skin. And that's generally slower than IV.
Okay.
Because the drug has to diffuse through the tissues to get to the bloodstream.
Okay.
And this slower absorption can actually be an advantage for drugs like insulin or heparin, where you want a constant sustained effect.
Right. Okay.
It also minimizes the risk of blood clots forming at the injection site compared to 5E.
Interesting.
But you have to be careful with drugs that are irritating to the tissues. Because they can cause pain or even damage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have all these injection methods.
Right.
There's also nasal inhalation.
Yeah.
Which seems like it would be pretty fast.
It is.
So breathe it in. It goes right to your lungs.
It gets absorbed very rapidly.
Okay.
Across the mucous membranes in your respiratory tract and your lungs.
So that's especially good for things like asthma.
Yes. Conditions like asthma, COPD.
Right, where you need...
Because you're delivering the medication directly to where it's needed.
Right, to the source.
Exactly.
And then you have topical and transdermal.
Okay.
They both involve the skin.
They do.
But they're pretty different.
Very different. Topical applications are things like creams and ointments.
Okay.
And those are for local effects.
Right, so like an anti-itch cream.
Exactly. Antifungal cream for a skin infection.
Got it.
Transdermal is usually a patch.
Okay.
And that's designed for systemic effects.
So it goes through the skin into the bloodstream?
Exactly. It releases the drug slowly and continuously, and it's absorbed through the skin.
So you get that slow release again.
Yeah.
But through a different method.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So like nicotine patches?
Exactly, nicotine patches.
Birth control patches.
Yeah, birth control patches. Those are good examples.
Okay. And then we have rectal administration. Not as common, but it is an option.
It is.
So what are the advantages of that?
So it has a couple of key advantages.
Okay.
About half of the blood flow from the rectal area bypasses the liver.
Okay.
So you reduce that first pass metabolism that we talked about earlier.
Right.
It also avoids the GI tract entirely.
Okay.
Which is helpful if a drug would be destroyed by stomach acid or enzymes.
Okay.
Or if the person can't swallow.
Right.
Or is vomiting or unconscious.
Okay. So it has its uses.
Yeah, it definitely has its place.
Okay, so we've seen all these different ways.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ways to get drugs in.
That drugs can get into the body.
Right.
Now they have to be absorbed.
Right.
They actually have to cross those biological barriers to get into the bloodstream.
They got to get in.
They got to get in.
To do their job.
Right.
Right.
And our material outlined a few different mechanisms for this. Okay. So let's go through those.
Right.
The main ways are passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport.
For really big drugs.
Yeah.
Endocytosis or exocytosis.
Right. Those are the main ones.
Okay, so let's start with passive diffusion because that sounds like the simplest.
It is.
Right, just moving from a high concentration to a low concentration.
Yeah, it's like if you drop a sugar cube into a cup of tea.
Okay.
The sugar molecules naturally spread out until they're evenly distributed.
Okay.
That's passive diffusion. Doesn't require any energy. Doesn't need any carrier proteins.
Okay.
It's not very selective.
So it's just going with a natural flow.
Exactly.
Okay, what about facilitated diffusion?
So facilitated diffusion...
It still goes from high to low.
Yeah, still high to low.
But it needs a helper.
But it needs a little help.
Right.
Yeah.
It can't just go through the membrane.
It relies on transport proteins that are embedded in the membrane.
Okay, so it needs like a specific doorway.
It needs a doorway.
Yeah. And someone to open it.
And someone to open it. That's a good way to put it. But it's still going downhill.
Yes. Yeah. Still going down the concentration gradient. Yeah. So no energy is needed.
Okay, active transport.
Active transport.
That sounds like it requires effort.
It requires energy. Yeah. This one uses carrier proteins as well, but it needs ATP, which is the cell's energy currency.
Yeah.
And this allows it to move drugs against the concentration gradient.
Oh, wow.
So from low concentration to high concentration.
So it's like pumping water uphill.
This is a great analogy.
Right. It takes energy to go against the natural flow.
Exactly.
And then we have endocytosis and exocytosis for the really big drugs.
The big ones.
That can't fit through the regular doors. How do those work?
So these are ways that the cell can engulf or expel very large molecules.
Okay.
So in endocytosis, the cell membrane actually surrounds the drug molecule and pinches off to form a little vesicle, which is like a little sac that brings the drug inside. And exocytosis is the opposite.
Got it.
It's where the vesicle fuses with the membrane and releases the drug outside.
So it's like a little package delivery system.
It is. It's very cool.
It is really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these different mechanisms. But our material also listed some general factors that influence how a drug is absorbed.
Yeah, there are other things that can affect it.
Yeah. And pH was one that really stood out.
pH is very important.
So why is pH so important for drug absorption?
Well, most drugs are either weak acids or weak bases.
Okay.
And their ability to cross cell membranes depends on whether they're ionized or unionized.
Okay. And ionized means?
Ionized means they have a charge.
Got it.
So they're either positively or negatively charged.
Okay.
And unionized means they have no charge.
Okay.
And generally, the unionized form is more lipid soluble.
Okay.
So it can pass through the cell membranes more easily.
Got it. So it's like a charge affects whether it can go through the door or not.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does the PK of a drug play into all of this?
So the PK of a drug is the pH at which 50% of the drug is ionized and 50% is unionized.
Okay.
So it's like that tipping point where half of it has a charge and half of it doesn't.
Got it.
And this is really important because the pH of different parts of the body.
Yeah, like the stomach is very acidic.
Exactly. The stomach is very acidic.
Right.
So a weak acid will be mostly unionized in the stomach.
Okay.
And therefore absorbed better there.
Got it.
But a weak base will be mostly ionized in the stomach and will be absorbed as well.
Okay.
So it might have to go further down to the intestine.
Right, where it's less acidic.
Or it's less acidic, exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And blood flow also affects absorption.
Yeah, blood flow is really important.
Yeah.
Because the more blood flow you have to a site, the faster the drug will be carried away.
Right.
And that maintains that concentration gradient.
Right. So it's like if you keep taking away...
Exactly. If you keep taking the drug away...
The drug from the area.
Right.
Then more can come in.
More can be absorbed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the intestines have way more blood flow.
They do.
Than the stomach.
Yeah, much richer blood supply.
So that's one reason why they're so good at absorbing stuff.
That's a big reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then surface area.
Surface area.
More area, more absorption.
More area, more absorption. That's pretty straightforward.
That's pretty straightforward.
But the intestines,
yes,
they win again.
They win again.
Because they have those villi and microvilli.
Exactly. They have those little finger-like projections that just increase the surface area tremendously.
It's kind of crazy how much...
It is.
How much more surface area.
It's about 1,000 times.
It's massive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's huge.
That really highlights how important they are.
They're the workhorse of absorption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last factor was contact time.
Contact.
So the longer the drug is in contact with the absorbing surface, the more time it has to be absorbed.
The more time it has to get across that barrier.
Right. Exactly.
So if you have diarrhea, for example.
Right. If something speeds up the transit time through your gut,
right,
then less drug is going to be absorbed.
Because it's just passing through too quickly.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the drug in the body.
Okay.
It's crossed some barriers. How do we know how much of it actually gets into the bloodstream?
Right.
Unchanged.
Yeah.
Ready to do its job.
That's where bioavailability comes in.
But bioavailability, okay, and that's a measure of?
Bioavailability is a measure of both the rate and the extent to which an administered drug reaches the systemic circulation.
Okay, so if you take a 100-milligram tablet
right,
and only 70 milligrams get absorbed unchanged into the bloodstream, that's 70% bioavailability.
70% bioavailability, that's right.
Okay, so it's the percentage of the drug that survives the journey.
Exactly, survives the journey and becomes available to the body.
Right.
Okay, so we've got a couple of things that can lower bioavailability. One of the main ones is this first-pass hepatic metabolism.
First-pass metabolism, that's a big one.
Which we touched on earlier.
Yeah, we mentioned it.
But let's go into a little more detail.
Okay.
Why is it so important?
So when you swallow a drug and it's absorbed from your GI tract, it doesn't go directly into your general circulation.
Okay.
It goes through the liver first via the portal vein.
Okay.
And the liver is like the body's main detoxification center.
Yeah, it's a busy place.
It's a busy place.
Yeah.
It's got all these enzymes that can break down drugs.
Right.
And so for some drugs, this first pass through the liver can really reduce the amount of drug that actually gets to its target.
Right.
Nitroglycerin is a great example.
Okay.
Over 90% of it can be cleared during its first pass.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's why you don't swallow nitroglycerin.
That's why it's often given sublingually or transdermally.
Right.
So it bypasses the liver.
It sneaks in the back door.
It sneaks in the back door.
Okay. So for drugs with a high first pass metabolism, you either have to give a much higher oral dose.
That's right. You have to give a lot more to make sure enough gets through.
Or choose a different route altogether.
Or you got to find a different way to get it in.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So solubility also affects bioavailability.
It does.
And we talked about how drugs need to be both lipid soluble and water soluble to be absorbed.
Yeah.
So how does that affect bioavailability as a whole?
Well, it needs that balance.
Okay.
Right? It needs to be lipophilic enough to cross membranes, but also water soluble enough to dissolve in fluids.
Right.
Like blood.
Be transported around.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why a lot of drugs are designed as weak acids or bases.
Okay.
Because they can kind of switch back and forth.
Oh, okay.
Depending on the pH.
So they can be fat-loving when they need to be.
Exactly.
And water-loving when they need to be.
Exactly.
Okay. And then chemical instability that can also reduce bioavailability.
Yeah. Some drugs are just not stable
in
that harsh environment of the GI tract.
Yeah.
Like penicillin G. It's broken down by the acid in the stomach.
Okay.
And insulin, which is a protein, can be degraded by enzymes in the intestines.
So the drug is its own worst enemy in some cases.
Sometimes it is, yeah.
And finally, the actual formulation of the drug.
Right, the formulation.
Can affect bioavailability, too.
The physical form can have a big impact on how quickly and how much of it dissolves.
Right, so like particle size.
Particle size.
Smaller particles dissolve faster.
Smaller is faster, usually.
Yeah.
And then the specific salt form, the crystal structure.
Okay.
Any coatings.
Right, like the enteric coating.
Like the enteric coating we talked about.
Even the inactive ingredient.
Even the excipients can all affect the bioavailability.
So there's so much that goes into
it's a lot.
Just getting the drug from your mouth into your bloodstream.
It's a whole process.
Yeah. Okay, so it's in the blood now.
Okay.
Where does it go?
That's distribution.
Distribution. So it's circulating through the body. Does it just go everywhere?
Well, it starts to distribute throughout the body
to
different tissues and organs, but it's not uniform.
Okay.
It's a reversible process.
Okay.
So the drug can move from the blood into the tissues and back again.
Okay.
But there are several factors that influence where it goes and how much gets there.
Okay. So blood flow seems like an obvious one.
Yeah. Blood flow is a big one.
Right.
Yeah.
More blood flow.
More drug.
More drug. Exactly.
The organs that get a lot of blood.
Yeah.
Like the brain, liver, kidneys.
Right. The brain, liver, kidneys. Those are what we call the vessel-rich organs.
Okay.
They get a lot of blood.
Right, so they get a bigger dose faster. They get the fast delivery.
Like the areas with the most traffic get the most deliveries.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about the permeability of the capillaries?
So the capillaries are those tiny blood vessels.
Right.
And their structure varies throughout the body.
Okay.
So in most tissues, there are little gaps between the cells that line the capillaries, and that allows drugs to pass through fairly easily.
Okay.
But in some places, like the brain, the capillaries are very tightly joined.
Right.
And that forms what we call the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah.
And that restricts the passage of a lot of drugs into the brain tissue.
Interesting.
Yeah. So to get into the brain, a drug typically needs to be very lipophilic.
Fat-loving.
Fat-loving.
Yeah.
So it can pass directly through those capillary cells.
Okay.
Or it needs to be actively transported.
Right. So it needs a special pass.
It needs a special pass.
To get through the blood-brain barrier.
Exactly.
Okay. What about binding to protein?
So a lot of drugs bind to proteins in the plasma.
Okay.
Mostly to albumin.
Okay.
And when a drug is bound to a protein, it's too big to leave the bloodstream easily.
Oh, okay.
So it can't distribute into the tissues as readily.
So it's like it's stuck to the protein.
Until it gets released.
Yeah, so plasma protein binding acts like a temporary storage site.
Okay, so it slows down the distribution.
It slows it down.
Yeah. And creates kind of a circulating reserve.
Actually, a circulating reserve.
Okay.
And drugs can also bind to proteins in specific tissues, which can lead to higher concentrations of the drug in those tissues.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And then lipophilicity is also important for distribution.
Yeah, just like with absorption. The drug's ability to dissolve in lipids affects its ability to cross membranes throughout the body.
Right.
So lipophilic drugs,
fat-loving
drugs, they can cross most membranes more easily than hydrophilic drugs. Right, so their distribution is mostly determined by blood flow.
Yeah, wherever the blood takes them, they can get in.
And then we have this volume of distribution.
Volume of distribution.
The V de Vedavipet.